So I want to start with a question that is certainly burning on the minds of many Americans, probably not so much this audience, but tell me, is Barack a socialist? You're a considered economic opinion.
I'm on leave. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago, and that's where I met the president. And I take it you're doing this as teasing me. All through the campaign, I was his main economic advisor through the campaign, and they would start on this, and so I would say, here they go. Is he a socialist? Are you this? And whenever somebody would say that, I'd say, are you a Muslim? Do you cavort with terrorists? And so look, he's not at all a socialist. He's always been a market-oriented Democrat. I mean, he's a Democrat, but he believes in a market. And the things that we've done that they keep saying are socialism, A, most of them started under the last president, and B, we only did them because we didn't want to go into the Depression.
Yeah. So actually, you got some nice plaudits from George Will during the campaign. He says, Goolsbee no doubt has lots of dubious ideas. He is, after all, a Democrat, about how government can creatively fiddle with the market's allocation of wealth and opportunity. But he seems to be the sort of person, amiable, empirical, and reasonable, you would want at the elbow of a Democratic president, if such there must be. What are Republicans thinking of now?
Yeah, I was going to say, that was a long time ago he wrote that. I've been kind of, I don't know if dismayed is the right word, but certainly getting to Washington, it's way highly partisan for my taste. Yeah, I'm not from Washington. I never had really been there before. It's been a little difficult to deal with that, and certainly on the recovery and stimulus and what do we do to avoid the Depression. I guess I was a little surprised that it was as contentious as it.
So a lot of attempt to pin blame on the other side as opposed to really solve. So
pinning blame, but more than that, kind of the. Let's try to do something. I mean, I don't think people, certainly at the exact moment it was happening, we didn't realize how close we were to the Great Depression of 1929 was big financial crisis plus deep recession leading to, plus some mistakes of government policy leading to collapse of the financial system, and that's essentially a downturn that you can't pull out of. That it doesn't negative feedback thing, which is very unusual. We had a financial crisis every bit as big, and by many measures bigger than the one in 1929. So, in 1929, household wealth, as best we can measure it after the fact, fell about 5%, which is totally unprecedented. In this financial crisis, the household balance sheet fell almost 15%. So the financial part of the thing was more than double the initial stage of the Depression. The recession's the deepest since 1929. If we had screwed things up, we would every bit be looking at the Depression. The thing that kind of surprised me is in that environment, I thought everybody would just, there would be if not universal, it'd be pretty broad consensus of we got to move quickly.
Well, there's definitely this Republican orthodoxy which has been, pushed by people like Amity Shlaes, which is, Roosevelt didn't really affect the Depression. It would have happened. We would have been out of it sooner if we hadn't done all that spending. So you think we're really on the right track and that we made the right choices?
I think we made a lot on the key points. It's not just the administration. I mean, the Fed deserves a lot of credit in this kind of later stage of the crisis. But I think we made several choices that were not the mistakes of 1929.
But if you could design the stimulus plan over again, I guess you guys didn't really design it, even though it's being characterized as Barack's plan. You kind of came in and, picked it up mid-play. But if you could design it from scratch with the benefit of hindsight, what would you do differently?
Ooh, that's a trick question. I would say, the first is I would pack more food in my desk and I would have a mattress in my office instead of sleeping under the desk and eating Tic Tacs, which was the typical thing. I would say the one change would be on process. Now, a significant fraction of the money, actually faster than what was expected, has either gone out or been contracted. But that's only with major implementation effort. And there were just, the whole thing was almost like an administration in a box, and we had to sort it all out in a matter of just a couple of weeks. And so things like, there's a provision that gives assistance for low-income people to retrofit their homes. So the view was, hey, it'll be a job creator, but it also can reduce their carbon footprint and save them money. We got into a huge thing of, well, would this be administered through the tax code, and then will it be refundable, and then arguments over the Davis-Bacon Act and what would be the wages that would be paid to the people who would go out and do the retrofit. So all of that delayed getting that program ramped up, and certainly if we had more time, we would have put more of the focus on that implementation side. I'd say if it was up to me, I would have put more money into the state fiscal relief. So you got 18,000 teachers, jobs. They were going to be fired in New York City, and their jobs were saved 60, 70,000 in California. But most states, as anybody from California knows, have got these balanced budget amendments. Yep. And so as stuff gets worse, they have to cut services and raise taxes to balance a budget. And so it's just exerting a big drag, the opposite of stimulus, whatever that is.
How much control does the administration have over where the stimulus money goes? I mean,
meaning what? Meaning to change it from what it was originally, or do you mean originally when they declared?
Just in terms of how the money is directed, how it's spent. It's just such massive amounts of money poured into very large categories with agencies that have existing mandates, existing channels of distribution, existing constituencies.
I don't think that's totally. I don't think that's. It had a pretty sizable control at the outset when they set it up, but a lot of the things are rather tightly directed as to what the money can go to, and taking the money out of the Department of Energy and using it for ham sandwiches or something and food.
No, I don't mean that. But for example,
there's not a whole lot of.
Yeah, I mean, did we put it in the right places? Is maybe the right question.
I mean, the view.
Let me ask this way.
Here's the view, and we're still early in the deployment of it. So it will take us years for the full. As the economist, people are going to be spending a long time going back. What was the most effective part of the thing? But the general view was $787 billion. You couldn't and you shouldn't try to dump it all in a 2-week period. Even if you could, would you want it all to be spent then? You wouldn't. And so it was some stuff that would go out right away, like the state fiscal relief and the tax cuts. There's a middle group of things which are kind of over the next 12 to 18 months. And then there's the longer term package, which is more the infrastructure, 18 to 36
Anish Chopra
months.
was talking, for example, about the administration's innovation agenda.
Yes.
Now, this idea that somehow if we're going to rebuild the American economy, it's going to be through innovative new industries. And yet, an awful lot of the money seems to have gone to propping up old industries. Did we put enough towards, and can you even put enough towards
that is an interesting question. There's about $18 billion went to research and development.
Out
it was
of
the
what?
biggest,
out of what?
787 billion.
Almost 800 billion. So that's a pretty small amount.
Yeah, but nobody, I don't think if you had gone to economists and said, there's 787 billion, what's something that would be immediate stimulus to the economy? R&D spending wouldn't be the obvious choice for the full amount.
Right.
It's the biggest expansion of government R&D spending ever in U.S. history.
Yeah.
But look, I agree with Anish, and I'm a big admirer of Anish. I think also if you look over the past economic history of the country, it is pretty notable that some of the most innovative and interesting companies are created in the wake, like the mammals and the meteor kills all the dinosaurs, in the wake of big recessions.
And they generally didn't do it because they got government stimulus money.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah.
And so, look, we got to grow into something. We've
Yeah.
gone through cycles of asset bubble-based recoveries,
Right.
and we got to get off that. I am a little nervous that the good news is Silicon Valley is not historically a big debt-driven. The companies of Silicon Valley tend not to be hugely levered. But that said, I don't think you can look at the broadly define the financing of entrepreneurs and be super heartened by where we are, whether it's because of regulation, whether it's because of credit crunch has driven money
Or
away, whether
immigration
it's because
policy.
of for a bunch of reasons. I think there are, either weaknesses or concerns that for sure we got to be on top of.
So, if you look at sort of jobs recovery, I think you were quoted on Politico a while back saying the jobs crisis is the hardest one to fix.
I said that.
That's what they said you said. And, a lot of the new kinds of industries that, we're building in Silicon Valley are not really jobs-based.
Right.
Some of them, certainly company gets to be the size of Google, they create some jobs. But there are an awful lot there's an awful lot of leverage where computers are doing the work.
Yeah.
That used to be done by humans. So, the whole trend towards IT automation has, removed a lot of jobs. And we're seeing this even more with new areas like robotics. What is the job engine for America in the future?
Okay, but hold on. You're sounding dangerously Ludditish.
No, I'm just.
Look, we've had 100 years of automation.
Yeah.
And yet, even in a jobs crisis, the unemployment rate is pushing 10%. It's not 99%, which
right. But as you mentioned, a lot of the jobs and a lot of the economic activity has been driven by this sort of cycle of consumption, which was debt fueled rather than real productivity fueled.
The economic growth, I think there are some people who, to my mind, are a little confused in that they have a bias toward the recent past. So they will look and say, hey, in 2004, we're in a boom, and that boom is driven by very rapid consumption growth and investment in residential real estate. Those are the two drivers of the boom. And that line of thinking says, for us to have a recovery again, we must restore housing construction, which has been very low, and we must restore super fast consumption growth, and those two things don't seem to be big drivers, so what are we going to do?
But
that's the mistake of the recent past. We don't have to have a recovery based on those.
Right, so if we don't want to go back to
investment, net exports, and consumption growth that's not faster than income growth. Okay, you can have consumption growth be a driver of boom without it being unsustainable, which it ended up getting to.
So when you say exports, what does the administration think of as the key areas where you see?
Well, look, I'm an economist, so I'm not going to answer that question. Like the last thing I want is the government to decide, here's what the export should be. It is a fact that the majority of exports from the country are in manufacturing. Yeah. And it is also a fact that in many previous recessions, as you come out of them, manufacturing is a highly cyclical business. So when you go into boom, they disproportionately grow, just as they disproportionately go down in the recession. So certainly forms of manufacturing might be one source of the exports, but various services, including a lot of technology-provided services, you could easily see that becoming a big engine of exports.
I have a technical question for you. If your regression exhibits heteroscedasticity, will the coefficient estimates be biased?
No.
That's what Hal Varian said you'd say.
That's the correct answer. The standard error will be wrong, but it won't be biased.
It's kind of a joke question, but...
no, it's a very important...
Because I'm not even sure what the heck it means. But it does illustrate the way that economics has become profoundly mathematical. Computer science also has become profoundly mathematical. Do we have the level of mathematical literacy that we need to even think about the problems that are facing us as a country? I mean,
Now,
think
wow,
about
that
when
was
you're
fancy.
dealing
You
with...
spun, I thought you were going one way, and you turned me a totally different way. So let us distinguish two parts of the world. One is, do we have enough mathematics to know about economics? And the other is, do we have enough mathematics as a society?
Right.
The answer to that one is almost certainly not.
Right.
The president's put a big focus on education, but as you know, in K through 12, the federal role is, this big. This is largely a state and local thing. Science, mathematics, and foreign language are areas where we've got to put in serious investment. Within economics...
Is it investment or is it motivation?
I think it's both of those. I mean, as you say, there's no excuse. I mean, the fundamental thing is parents got to teach their kids, the school's got to teach, you got to be, the parental involvement in your school. There's no replacement for that. Right. The federal government is not going to change that. But that said, the setting of standards is a role that the federal government has played in a lot of different areas.
There's a really kind of interesting thing that I see from where I sit. We for example, publish a magazine called Make, which is really about people having fun with technology. And it's led us to look at a lot of the early literature of invention. And you go back to the earlier days of America, from the turn of the century up through the 40s and 50s, and like stories for kids are all about making stuff and involves a lot of math. I have this wonderful book from 1909, The Scientific American Boy Goes to School. And it involves a project where this kid it's literally the story includes plans for a boat powered by a paddle wheel boat powered by a bicycle. And it's got diagrams, it's got engineering, it's got equations. This is the imaginative boy of 1909, doing math for fun. And now we've turned it into this terrible chore.
Right. This is like, remember those old Back to the Future movies? Yeah. And then the guy goes back in time and he says, "You're from the future. What do they do for fun in the future?" He goes, "I don't know. Go for a run." The guy goes, "Run for fun? What the hell kind of fun is that?" I'm sure if you told kids today, yes, here you can compute how fast you'd have to ride this bicycle to drive down the Mississippi River. I mean, they would say, what the hell kind of fun is that?
Yeah. But I still think about, what are the drivers that are going to make kids, do we have, and so that, of course, leads me to things, again, like innovation, investment. The space program was one of those things. I remember talking with Burt Rutan. He says, we all grew up dreaming of what we wanted to do, and that was what drove aviation, what drove space. And, what are the big dreams that, is there any, President Obama wrote a book called Dreams from My Father, and we've seen the administration get mired down in a lot of, we haven't been hearing those dreams anymore. Do we have dreams to drive the recovery?
Whoa. I was going to say, now what motivates kids to dream? I don't know. We got the "What Do Teens Want" panel. The dreams were stomped out of us. We're old enough that our dreams were stomped out of. We got to turn to the younger folks. Look, I'm not an expert on educational methods or pedagogy, but I will say the one measure of the skill of a country is what share of 25-year-olds have a college degree. Yeah. And the U.S., for all of our discussions about the quality of our education system, for many, many years, the U.S. was number one in the world on that measure. And in the last 5 to 10 years or so, we've actually fallen dramatically. Yeah. Not because we've gotten dumber, but because the rest of the world figured out, hey, they're really onto something, and they put a huge focus on getting big. And so now I think we're number 18 or 22, and we're right below Bulgaria and above Costa Rica.
Right. So basically,
and I said, now I had a PhD student from Bulgaria, got very offended that I started saying this. Said, what are you saying about Bulgaria? I'm not saying anything. All I'm saying is, if you have the skill level between Bulgaria and Costa Rica, look, 25 years from now, you're going to have the income level between Bulgaria and Costa Rica. The economics basically shows you that. And I don't think the American people are at a spot where they say, oh, okay, 25 years from now, we may be somewhere in Eastern
We want to be
Europe.
number
Yeah,
one.
you know, we want to be number one. So I think whatever the motivation, we gotta.
Well, that's certainly a lesson we're seeing right now played out in this Web 2.0 space. You know, there's real competition in the industry again, and it actually creates a lot of excitement. We had competing announcements from Google and Microsoft because there was real competition again in the industry, and so maybe we're going to see this competition get us fired up again. So thinking about recovery, just before we came out, John Battelle mentioned that Amazon beat their earnings. And asked the question: is this a sign of a retail rebound? American Express beat their earnings. Is that a sign of fewer card defaults? If you read the tea leaves, are there things that you see that are telling us whether we're going in the right direction or the wrong direction?
I think if you just take one step back, a longish view, not even the long view, just look over 6 months and say, okay, the last 2 or 3 months, how do they compare to the 2 or 3 months, December, January, February? It's obvious we're miles and miles away from that. We're still in a tough spot. You know you're in a crappy place when you can raise the GDP growth rate 5.5%, which is a big boom in itself, 5.5%, and we're still negative. And that's what happened. We were at minus 6.8%, which is epically bad, worse than a half century kind of thing. And we upped it by a giant boom, and we're still in negative what would territory. Be considered a relatively serious recession.
Yeah.
So I think most of the indicators have gotten better, or at least stabilized. And unfortunately, the way recoveries progress tends to be the first thing you turn around is the GDP. Personal incomes can start to go up. Eventually, you get payroll employment growing, and the unemployment rate is the last thing to come down, because people forget you only count in the unemployed if you're looking for a job. If you've dropped out of the labor force, you don't count as unemployed. So a bunch of people are out of the labor force, and when the economy starts generating jobs again, they're going to come back in and look for jobs. So the unemployment rate can rise even when you have that.
Net, are you worried about the amount of debt that we've taken on? Are we going to destabilize the dollar? Are we going to?
Yeah, you mean the national debt?
Yeah,
I'm worried about household. I'm worried about debt in general.
Yeah.
The first thing I'll say, look, this is emergency. If you had asked people in 1928 or 1929, here is what is about to happen over the next decade, how much would you borrow right now to avoid that? The answer is any rational person would have done a lot to try to prevent that from happening.
Right.
And that's where we were. The long-term debt issues are not associated with the short-run downturn in the economy, the stimulus, or anything of the sort. And they aren't associated. The 10-year deficit, the budget is added up in 10-year increments. And the 10-year deficit has gone up by several $1 trillion from what it was forecast to be 2 or 3 years ago. If you ask, I feel this conventional wisdom congealing, which is totally wrong. And certainly if you go ask Sean Hannity, he will say, the reason the 10-year deficit is up is because that crazy socialist Obama is spending us into oblivion. And it's totally incorrect.
It was that crazy socialist George Bush.
It was this crazy, but look, the main reason that the 10-year deficit has gotten bigger is, number one, the current state of the economy has a direct impact on what the projected deficits are. So when we're in a boom, the 10-year deficit tends to look better than expected, and when you're in a recession, it looks worse. And this is the worst recession since 1929, so of course that thing got a lot worse. Number two, Washington has engaged. We purposefully ceased using a series of budget gimmicks that have been there since time immemorial. So things like, in the budget, it says at the end of the year, they are going to cut all the salaries of doctors by 20%. They're just going to declare that they're going to pay less for all the medical services. And then at the end of each year, they say, well, we're going to put that off till next year. But for the 10-year deficit, we are going to do that next year and every year in the future. The R&D tax credit is a temporary tax credit that they renew over and over. Obama comes in and says, let's make that permanent. A, so that the companies themselves can count on it being there.
Yeah.
But B, what is the point of calling it temporary when everybody's down there trying to renew it every year?
So the point is this is more honest.
Okay, so it's like, let's be honest. They put $0 for natural disasters, even though there's a hurricane season every year. And then they say, oh my God, there was a hurricane in Florida. How could we have predicted that? And so then they ask for a one-time supplement of budget. So you put all those things in there. Now that adds up to a 10-year deficit. But you haven't spent anything that wasn't going to be spent anyway. Our long-run fiscal challenge is and remains what it has been we've known about it for 25 years. The long-run growth of healthcare costs, and to a lesser extent the aging of the population, mean that entitlement costs are really large, and we're going to have to confront that. Now, in a world, as I say, where they're down there screaming that you want to pull the plug on grandma because we're talking about, changing what the Medicare, should we subsidize private Medicare versus public? I don't think in the next 3 months we're going to have a big discussion about the long-run fiscal position, but it hasn't gotten any worse in the last 2 years.
So I realize I should have called for questions from the audience earlier. We're now down to only a minute or two, but is anybody out there who has a burning question? We can take.
I do. Sean Cunningham from Snaptic. I'm wondering, is Barack Obama really an American citizen? My real question is serious, but I couldn't help myself. The discussion on mathematics was interesting, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, kind of the government and past administrations being kind of drunk in their decision-making process when you look at the prescription bill that kind of put price fixing in, so we can't use collective bargaining to buy down pricing on, and it seems to me to be the same argument as having a public option now, which can, produce the same effect, which is to reduce costs. And, I wonder what your opinion is.
Well, my opinion, look, on the birther controversy, sometimes they would get on me. Oh, and this, how do we know that? And I say, I was born in Waco, Texas, so I never accuse anybody of any, they're coming for us next if they get on that. Look, what you raise is, I'm an economist, so maybe it's predictable that I would think that, but the most effective way that we know of to reduce cost and to slow the inflation rate is competition. And you see that in marketplace after marketplace. The health insurance market is a weird space because we've got a thing where they compete by getting better and better at excluding the sick. And I don't think you can look at the science side of this and not be real worried about maintaining the status quo, because they're going to get really, really good in the near future at figuring out who's going to get sick. So that kind of competition, I think as a society, it's quite important.
That's a key web squared concept. That's where science is going to change that.
So the thing is, science is going to change that. So we've got to get the system off of that kind of competition too. And look, I agree with the wackiness of the government and some of the decisions that have been made in recent years and some long-standing. You kind of can't believe it. And they're a lot of times geared explicitly toward let's not have any competition. And then surprise, surprise, prices go way up when you don't have any competition.
Okay, let's take one more and then we've got to wrap. Over here.
Hi, I appreciate that the deficit is related to the growth of the economy and the tax input, but given that there's a lot of programs that are going to come online, possibly cost money, whether it's the medical insurance reform or the energy bill, it seems likely that the deficit's going to get bigger. What's the way out of that, and what's the administration going to do to kind of reduce that in the long term?
Well, I would be a little careful. Look, the president committed that for the stuff that we come up with, and you see it playing out in the health plan now, that there are people saying, oh, we wish it was bigger and more expansive. The president committed that the health plan's got to be paid for the 10-year deficit number would not increase from that. The same would certainly be true of the energy bill. They've committed to, in the Washington speak, a pay-as-you-go, that anything you come up with is going to be paid for. Now, that shouldn't apply. People say, well, what about the stimulus? Paid for stimulus is not stimulus. If you're putting it in and taking it out, that's the immediate term, get us out of the crisis, is a fundamentally different thing than going forward. I totally agree with you, and I think the president's is in that same place, that any new programs, they got to be paid for, and as I say, the real long-run fiscal challenges facing the country are centered around these big entitlement issues. They aren't about discretionary, arguing over this or that discretionary program. I think that's the...
So hopefully we get out of this crisis and then tackle
and then let's
big long-term problems.
address that. I think.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been fascinating. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.